Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Jessica Renard. Thank you for joining us today for our Veriforce webinar on what you need to know about the OQ Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or NPRM. We're excited to share with you the latest updates we've gotten from PHMSA's proposed changes to the OQ rule. First, let me introduce myself and our panel. As I said, I'm Jessica Renard. I'm the product manager for Veriforce, which is our integrated software compliance management application. I've gained knowledge on the topics we'll be discussing today from my 9 years with Veriforce, helping our clients stay in compliance with government regulations. Previous to that, I worked for a pipeline construction company as an OQ coordinator and designated employer representative for about 5 years. Tom Meek is the compliance director for Veriforce. Tom has spent 20 years in the natural gas business. He's had operations and compliance experience for Kinder Morgan and for El Paso Corporation, where he chaired El Paso's OQ committee. He's also served on various industry committees, including ASME's B31Q. We're also happy today to be joined by a former Veriforce team member, Todd Cash. Todd is now Operations and Compliance Manager for Sempra U.S. Gas and Power. He's had extensive experience with pipeline safety compliance programs with direct responsibility for those programs for 2 major gas companies. And he's also served in a consulting capacity for various compliance programs. Thanks, Todd and Tom, for joining us today. A little about Veriforce. Veriforce Solutions, just for anybody who's not familiar with Veriforce as a company, we combine software, value-added audit, consulting services, and we also offer a full suite of training. Our clients rely on us as the only single-source provider of solutions they need to enhance the safety of their workforce and the communities that they serve. Veriforce, which you'll hear me refer to throughout our webinar, is our integrated software for compliance management. This includes compliance management for operator qualification, or OQ, drug and alcohol, and safety. Our unique integrated approach allows our clients to establish and manage their compliance programs more efficiently and mitigate risk effectively, working with a single vendor. We have over 140 energy and utility companies that we serve. It includes upstream, midstream, LDCs, or local distribution companies, municipalities, power gen, and even the refining sector. And through that, we also work with a network of over 7,000 contractors across the nation. A little about today's agenda. As currently outlined, the PHMSA NPRM promises to have a significant impact on the OQ programs of energy and utility companies and contractors that it regulates. Our objective today is to help give you some insight into the expected new requirements and to help you prepare so that you'll be in a better position to comply with those. Here's a look at what we're going to cover in the next hour. First off, we may have a lot of people in the audience who are relatively new to the OQ rule, so Tom will be reviewing some basic information. Next, we'll get into the specifics of the new rule based on the NPRM that was published in 2015 and the updates that PHMSA has given us since that time. Todd is going to give us a really good perspective of what these new requirements are going to mean to the operators and contractors that they affect, both from an operations and a field level. Then I'll share with you some thoughts on what technology can do to help ease the burden of this new regulation. Finally, at the end, we will have some time for questions, so make sure that you submit those. Before we launch into the main presentation, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. First of all, today's event will be about an hour long, and it will be recorded. At the end of the event, we'll email you a link to the archived recordings so that you can view the presentation and listen to the presentation again. And we absolutely encourage you to share this with your colleagues. Please make sure that you disable any pop-up blockers, and feel free to submit questions to our speakers using the Q&A box on your screen. As I noted earlier, at the end of the presentation, we will be taking some of those questions and providing some answers and some clarification where needed. Please also take a minute to visit the Resource Center. We've provided a lot of really good, helpful information in that area for your reference. If you have any kind of technical difficulties, first step is always try to refresh your screen. You can do so by selecting the Control key and the F5 key on your keyboard. If that doesn't work, definitely feel free to reach out to us in the Q&A box on that as well. And with that, I think we should get started. So Tom, I'm going to hand this off to you.
Thanks, Jessica. Let's take a quick look at the current operator qualification rule. Concerns over a number of pipeline incidents but focus on the qualification of personnel operating the pipelines, and ultimately led to the provision in the laws that govern pipeline safety. On August 27, 1999, the U.S. Department of Transportation's Office of Pipeline Safety publish new regulatory requirements as part of 49 CFR 192 and 195. These regulations have become known throughout the energy and utility industry as Operator Qualification, or OQ Rule. In brief, the OQ Rule requires energy and utility companies to determine the covered tasks for which personnel must be qualified, identify abnormal operating conditions and ensure that qualified individuals can recognize and react appropriately, implement a process for evaluating personnel qualifications that is objective, consistent, and documented, develop and follow a written qualification program, and maintain records to document compliance. The OQ Rule is a recognition that mistakes will be made. The rule aims to ensure the pipeline workforce is qualified to do the work and minimize accidents due to human error and the impact of those when they do occur. We're all interested in avoiding incidents and accidents. Energy and utility companies also face potential penalties if they fail to comply with the OQ Rule. Some individual civil penalties for failure to comply have reached into hundreds of thousands of dollars. For example, a $788,000 fine was assessed in 2010 for an operator failing to identify a covered task, mud plugs, and failing to properly qualify personnel. This chart shows the trend in total dollars and number of civil penalties. The focus for operator qualification requirements is covered tasks. In the current rule, covered tasks is defined by what is known as the four-part test. It's an activity that the company identifies that, first, is performed on a pipeline facility, second, is an operations or maintenance task, third, is performed as a requirement of the regulation, and fourth, affects the operation or integrity of the pipeline. An individual is qualified if they have been evaluated and can A, perform assigned covered tasks, and B, recognize and react to abnormal operating conditions. The rule defines acceptable methods for evaluation. Abnormal operating conditions are those that may indicate a malfunction of a component or a deviation from normal operations that may A, indicate a condition exceeding design limits, or B, result in a hazard to persons, property, or the environment. Span of control is defined as not specifically in the rule, but however, the idea is covered in the requirement to allow for non-qualified individuals to perform a covered task if directed and observed by a qualified individual. And management of change is also not defined, but the rule requires companies to provide for the communication of changes that affect covered tasks to the individual performing them. The regulated company's OQ plan must outline the requirements that its employees must meet, as well as contractors, subcontractors, and any other entity performing a covered task, before they can perform covered tasks on the pipeline facilities. The current OQ rule requires written qualification program, including 7 elements. The company must, first, identify covered tasks to be included in qualification programs. Second, ensure through evaluation that individuals performing covered tasks are qualified. Third, allow non-qualified personnel to perform covered tasks if directed and observed by a qualified individual. Fourth, evaluate an individual if there is evidence that the individual's performance contributed to an incident or an accident. Fifth, evaluate an individual if there is evidence that the individual is no longer qualified to perform a covered task. Sixth, communicate changes that affect how covered tasks are performed to the individuals performing them. For example, company policy and procedure changes, regulation changes, new equipment or technology, or new information from manufacturers. And seventh, identify intervals at which evaluation requalification is needed for each covered task. In addition, companies are required to maintain records to demonstrate compliance with the OQ rule. Who was qualified on what covered tasks, when they were qualified, and how they were qualified.
Now, on to what's changing. Starting with a little background on what has prompted the changes. First, there have been many incidents in recent years in which human error has still been a factor. This has led PHMSA and NTSB to decide that there is need to be some changes in the regulation. In addition, based on PHMSA's discussion with industry stakeholders, gaps have been identified between the OQ rule and actual operations in the field. Although many of these issues have been dealt with in the revised ASME B31Q standard on pipeline personnel qualification, it was determined that PHMSA should amend the OQ regulation to more thoroughly address the gaps. Also, there are deficiencies in the current rule. For example, due to the flexibility of current performance-based rule, it can be difficult to measure compliance. Many operations and maintenance tasks are not specifically called out, so there is room for confusion about which tasks meet the four-part test. And the four-part test omits some very important tasks, such as all construction tasks on new pipelines. In addition, OQ requirements have not been applied consistently across all categories of pipeline. PHMSA is seeking to rectify these deficiencies with the new rule.
At a high level, the new OQ rule is expected to bring an expanded definition of covered tasks so that more tasks are included. It's really a cradle to grave for the pipeline, and more companies are subject to the requirements. A new focus on training as a requirement for qualifying an individual on a covered task, and new requirements for assessing the effectiveness of OQ programs acting on that review. Let's take a look at the specific proposed new updated requirements that are likely to have the most impact. They fall into 6 categories.
First, the proposed changes result in a broader scope. A covered task is defined as an activity identified by the operator that affects the safety or integrity of the pipeline. This includes not only operations and maintenance tasks, but also construction, integrity management, and emergency response tasks. The proposed rule goes on to define emergency response tasks as those O&M tasks that could reasonably be expected to be performed during an emergency to return the pipeline facility to a safe operating condition.
In the proposed rule, the definition of qualified is also expanded. In order to be qualified on covered tasks, an individual must not only be evaluated and able to perform assigned covered task and recognize and react to abnormal operating conditions, the individual must also demonstrate knowledge required to perform the covered task, including variations that may be encountered in the covered task performed due to equipment and environmental differences. Demonstrate technical skills required to perform the covered task, and meet the physical abilities required to perform the specific covered task, such as colored vision and hearing. The proposed rule clarifies the provisions for using non-qualified personnel within specific definition of direct and observe and span of control. In addition, qualification program requirements indicate the span of control limits must be established for each covered task, and record-keeping requirements for program records includes the span of control ratios for each covered task. This is provided to illustrate or clarify the span of control ratio that must be established and followed for each covered task. There's potential that the span of control could go to a limit of 1:1. The proposed OQ rule adds a requirement that operator qualification programs include the provision to provide training to ensure the individual has necessary knowledge, skills, and abilities, KSAs, to perform the task in a manner that ensures pipeline safety and integrity. In addition, as a co-requisite, the individual will be required to know company-specific procedures. The program must also provide a supplemental training when procedures, and specifications for covered task change. A new requirement is proposed to assess program effectiveness and act on the results of the review. Effective program minimizes human error caused by lack of knowledge, skills, and abilities to perform a covered task. Program effectiveness review once each calendar year, not to exceed 15 months. A written program process must evaluate whether the program is being implemented and executed as written, establish provisions to amend the program as necessary to address the review findings. And measures must include, at a minimum, number of occurrences caused by individual whose performance of a covered task adversely affected pipeline safety or integrity due to any of specified deficiencies.
Also added is a requirement that the qualification program establish what is required to be an evaluator, including what training is necessary, and, as part of the measure of program effectiveness, consider any deficiencies due to an evaluator not following the program requirements.
While the current rule requires communication of change that affect a covered task, the proposed rule elevates the requirement to a management of change program, along with related record-keeping requirements. Record-keeping requirements are expanded under the proposal, specifying individual qualification records and program records. Individual qualification records must be maintained that demonstrate compliance with the key provisions of the regulation, in addition to covered tasks qualified to perform, methods and dates of qualification. The company must also document the evaluation to recognize and react to abnormal operating conditions, the name of the evaluator and date per covered task, training required to support individuals' qualifications or requalification, and the individual qualification records must be retained for an appropriate period of time. New for record keeping is a requirement to maintain program records that demonstrate compliance with the key provisions of the regulation, including, at a minimum, program effectiveness, program changes, list of AOCs, program management of change notifications, covered task lists, span of control ratios, reevaluation intervals, and evaluation methods for each covered task. Criteria and training for evaluators, evaluator performance, and the program records that also must be retained for an appropriate period of time. Those are the changes that we expect to have the most impact. Now we'll hear from Todd, from the perspective of a pipeline operator, on the impact of those changes and considerations for implementing them.
Thanks, Tom. The expanded scope here for operators is going to be pretty significant. One of the biggest changes is recognizing new covered tasks. We're going to have to look at our programs and make sure that we have covered tasks for new construction, the O&M activities, additional covered tasks for emergency response that we expect some other entity to perform on our behalf during an emergency, and also integrity management programs. Another piece is we have to identify, train, and qualify individuals performing those tasks. So a lot of programs didn't include extensive training for that, just in certain cases as the current rule is written. So now we're going to have to identify additional training. And in addition to that is also training, or at least acknowledgement of our policies and procedures. Also in the evaluations now, we're going to have to make sure that we include the technical skills to be able to perform those. So we have to make sure they have the ability to perform those activities. And then also we have to go through and look at each individual task and determine the difficulty, complexity, and importance of that task to determine the span of control limitations. And based off of what was discussed in June in Washington, D.C., we suspect that's going to be even tightened more and won't allow so much flexibility for having unqualified personnel performing covered tasks. The new training requirements, like I mentioned before, are really going to bring in a lot into our qualification process. So we're going to have to look at how we're doing that, whether or not we use a computer-based training like it's offered by Veriforce or something similar there that's used there. Also, we're going to have to look at the AOCs. How is that training being conducted, and are we properly covering both generic and task-specific AOCs during the training and evaluation. And also, we're going to have to address whether or not there's any variations in equipment and/or environmental conditions when we're doing that. If a person's qualified here in Texas, does that mean he can now be qualified in North Dakota? There may be environmental conditions that would not allow that to happen. We're going to need to review or do a program effectiveness. This is a big piece here on how we'll have to go out there and actually review our programs to see how effective they are there. It's not going to just be a headquarters in the office type review. We're actually going to have personnel in the field looking at to see how evaluators are performing their job, how a cover task being performed. And if there's ever any accident or incident on a pipeline, then we also have to go and look at our OQ programs to see how that may be effective based off of those reviews. And also the big piece on this is it's something that's going to be used by PHMSA and the state agencies as an auditing point. They're going to ask to see these records. For the new evaluator requirements, as Jessica mentioned, we're going to have to enhance those. Programs such as Veriforce have a very robust program of who can be an evaluator, what type of criteria they have to meet to do that, and what kind of training they have to go through. But internally, we have, as operators, sometimes have not done that good of a job based off of, okay, a person's been in a position for 10 years, now he's an evaluator for everything. I don't think that will no longer be acceptable for that. So we're going to have to enhance those programs. And then the last piece is greater attention to management of change. Operators, we have robust programs internally for doing this, but now we've got to make sure that we're including anyone that is performing a covered task. If there's any type of change to a procedure or how the task is being performed, now we're going to have to make sure that's communicated to all qualified personnel, field personnel, contractors, and supervisors out there that may be involved. And then there's additional record-keeping requirements. Like Jessica mentioned earlier, we have evaluator records, so the training, that selection criteria, we're really going to have to document that. We may have to actually keep a list of AOCs as spelled out currently in the NPRM. The span of control for each cover task, as you mentioned earlier, Tom, and also any agency notification. So if there's any significant changes to our programs, we've got to ensure that we're communicating that to PHMSA and the applicable state agencies.
Jessica, can we now look at how technology can help?
Sure, Tom. Well, now that we have looked at these changes that are expected with the proposed OQ rule, let's talk about what technology has to offer that can actually make this easier for you if you're in the position of compliance. Tom, both you and Todd have both outlined several specific program changes that are going to require a comprehensive tracking and reporting effort. So I'm going to dig into a few of those. Perhaps one of the biggest changes that we've outlined today and is present in the OQ NPRM is the criteria for what it takes to be a qualified person. In the current rulemaking, an evaluation is sufficient. However, that soon may be changing, as we've discussed. Under the new OQ rule, qualification will be the result of an individual meeting 3 co-requisite requirements. This will include evaluation, training on the task at hand, as well as task-specific policy and procedure awareness. This is a really big change. So for those in the audience who are heavily involved in OQ program compliance, you know what the current rulemaking requires. A lot of organization and a lot of paperwork. Now imagine tripling that. Technology can help you with this. Look for a centralized qualification tracking software to make this a much easier task. A single source solution to help you streamline those efforts will be really helpful because it will keep all of your requirements, everything from managing those requirements to tracking them, to notification of change, and to the documentation side of it being in one location will make this much simpler. This would also include, ideally, a one-stop shop where you can manage the task list itself, which we all know is going to be growing based on what we talked about earlier, where new construction would be incorporated into the new rule. Also, there will be a need to manage all reevaluation, retraining intervals, span of control, as we discussed earlier, and even look for a really good method and an integrated solution for managing updates or a need for re-review of requirements. This will make the job of managing multiple requirements simpler by relating everything and putting it in the same place. Lastly, I'll say that whatever software program you choose, ensure that it has a simple user interface. Because a software program can be really great, but if you can't figure out how to use it, then it's pretty much worthless. And we talked earlier about how the OQ NPRM requires companies to establish criteria and training requirements for becoming an evaluator. Well, this sounds simple enough, but there's a lot of tracking and documentation that's related to such a program. Finding the right software to track and house not only evaluation results, but also the evaluation records, everything from who was evaluated, when did the evaluation take place, who was the evaluator, and what kind of training has that evaluator had. That's going to be key for you. Look for a simple user interface, again, something that's going to be intuitive enough for all users, especially since the ones conducting the evaluations probably spend more time in the field than they do behind a computer. You know, we talked earlier about the OQ NPRM requiring training as a prerequisite to qualification. Individuals who historically were deemed qualified by passing an evaluation, that's no longer going to be good enough. Under the proposed rulemaking, training must also take place, and that training needs to be tracked, verified, and when applicable, refresher training will need to be administered. With the inclusion of new construction tasks that Tom and Todd discussed earlier, you can also expect the number of people who will need to be trained to increase significantly. While most agree that on-the-job training is ideal, it's not always practical, especially in a real-world, fast-paced environment. With so many people now being subject to retraining requirements, and with the increase in the number of people being subject to these requirements, it's really important to find a reliable and effective training source. But it's also equally important to find an efficient way to deliver the training. Most successful companies are looking for quality, computer-based training programs to help streamline compliance with this new requirement. Veriforce Training Management, for example, is the Veriforce product that helps our clients meet these requirements even today. It includes assignment features, completion reporting, and access to client training libraries. Our cover task training library is interactive, relatable, and built in collaboration with subject matter experts, so it makes sense to the people taking the training. This is the kind of product that you want to look for. And I'll say this again, a simple user interface is really important. For example, in Veriforce, trainees by default can only view the page where they have to take the training. This makes it easy for the trainee to find the task at hand, take the training, and get to work. We also talked earlier about, in addition to the new training requirements, policy and procedure awareness is going to be a requirement in order for an individual to be deemed qualified. Unlike evaluation and task training, which in many cases follows contractor qualified personnel from one client job site to another, policy and procedures are very specific to clients or to the operators that they belong to. We have a number of clients who already require policy and procedure review and acknowledgement as a prerequisite to qualification. And I can tell you, while there may be one or two evaluations or training courses per qualification, there are typically numerous policies and procedures associated with just one qualification task. And this is a lot to keep track of. This is where the really big spreadsheets come from. Or you can let technology help you. The most successful companies are looking for integrated requirement management systems to help manage all of those requirements in one location. Again, integrating all of those requirements. And also another thing to look for is a way to track each record and provide flexibility to make updates in this one simple user interface. Management of change is something that we talked about earlier as well. The OQ NPRM requires the energy and utility companies that it regulates to communicate change related to their OQ program. This includes changes to evaluation criteria, task training, and one or all policies and procedures that may have an update or change. Look for software which provides the ability to auto-generate emails or some other effective method of mass communication to ensure that affected parties are notified of a change, especially as it relates to task qualification. In addition, if retraining is required and the qualified person does not take action, there needs to be an easy, simple way to remove that person's qualification until the requirement is met. This is even more reason to look for an integrated software solution. The NPRM also contains multiple requirements related to program effectiveness, including requiring companies to have a written process to ensure their qualification program is effective and conduct reviews of that at least annually, not to exceed 15 months. The right compliance management system can help streamline this process. Look for a single source that can help you essentially capture program metrics, report measures, and identify trends. And then take those trends and determine whether or not you need to make a change to your program to improve it or strengthen it. Things to look for are organized record-keeping processes and also a vendor that has expertise in the area of demonstrating program compliance. An ideal situation would be finding a solution that has well-established process for quality control checkpoints and auditing not only of qualified personnel, but also of evaluators and obviously documentation. For our clients, providing an all-encompassing audit program has proven invaluable. We audit documentation, paperwork, and personnel on a daily basis to ensure reporting compliance for our clients. We also report all of this in one simple user interface. Again, a single source solution. Lastly, I'll talk about record keeping. Record keeping is crucial. In the world of compliance, if you didn't document it, it didn't happen, right? Some important things to look for, again, are centralized single-source solutions so that all documentation is in one place. And the ability to provide in a timely fashion, that documentation when asked for is very important, especially during an inspection. You can ask anybody who's been through one. Finally, I would suggest that you look for a technology company that has good information security practices, especially when you're trusting an outside vendor with your documentation for your program. Look for a vendor that's going to have secure, reliable document storage, including redundancy of servers, and ensure that your document retention periods are adequate. So that's it from the technology side. With that, I'll pass it back to you, Tom.
In summary, the proposed amendments to the OQ rule will have significant impact for most OQ programs. It's important to determine the gaps between your current program and the new requirements. The right technology make bridging those gaps much easier, and Veriforce is here to help.
That wraps up our presentation today. Now we'd like to try to address some of the questions that you may have. Let's see here. Here's a question about training. The question says, as an operator, I have internal training for my employees. How can I get my contractors that same kind of training? Jessica, this sounds like a good question for you. Can you handle that one?
Sure, Tom, thanks. That's a really good question. A lot of our clients ask that same question when they come on board, and they have these really well-developed internal training programs that were related to their specific tasks. And they ask, how do I get this to my contractors and manage, communicating it to hundreds or sometimes thousands of actual contractor workers? Veriforce Training Management is the tool that we offer our clients to help them meet that requirement. They can manage their training library within our one system. They can manage that for their own employees and also assign it to their contractors and make it a requirement to be able to perform work on their facilities. It also includes the ability for assignments, gap reporting, and just gives them a really good picture of where their contractors are at as far as training requirements are concerned.
Thank you, Jessica. Another question is, what kind of new construction tasks will be considered covered tasks? I think I'll field that one. I believe there'll be tasks similar to our current new construction for 80% SMICE pipelines. Covered tasks that you might see but not limited to pipeline offloading and handling, the receipt of the pipe right into the yard and loading, hauling, and stringing. Other tasks that you can imagine would be pipeline inspection, excavation ditches, pipe bending, welding, field coating inspection, jeeping, and coating repairs right in the field. All of the new construction tasks, including lowering the pipe right into the ditch, to name a few. Okay, Todd, I think this one's for you. What do you see the biggest impacts for operators?
Well, Tom, I think the biggest impacts for us will be the expanded cover task list, assuring that we have the expected tasks for new construction, integrity management, and those activities we may assign to emergency response personnel. And then also adding the training element on top of the qualification piece for that, along with the review of our policies and procedures. Another one is the management of change. How are we going to communicate those changes that we have, especially when we make some type of significant change to our own policy or procedure to our contractors who are performing that work on our behalf? And then also the program effectiveness. How are we going to staff up for that? How are we actually going to go out there and perform the effectiveness reviews of our programs that PHMSA is going to be expecting us to do?
That's all the time we have for today. If you submitted a question and we didn't get to it, we'll respond by email in the next few days. If you have additional questions, go ahead and submit them now. If you'd like to talk to someone at Veriforce about some of the information we covered today, you can contact Jessica or myself, or you can contact Todd by the email addresses here. Once again, you can expect to receive an email with a link to the recorded webinar if you want to watch again or share it with colleagues. For your convenience, we will also be distributing a copy of the slides to everyone who registered for the webcast today. We hope that you found our webinar informative. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great rest of the week.